Hey everyone, welcome back. I hope you're having a fantastic day. We are going to be doing another breakdown of how I created this piece with the focus on giving you techniques of creating depth and helping creating a three-dimensional space in a 2D surface. Or giving you the illusion of a 3D space on 2D surface. So let's jump into it. Starting with the sketch. There aren't really many techniques for creating depth in a sketch. Most of it's going to be coming through the rendering, but some way techniques you can do that I use is hi Squeedo, using thicker lines or darker lines in the foreground and lightening up as we get towards the background. This helps me remember which area I want towards the front versus the back, especially if I'm sending it off to a client to review. It helps them see the layering process of that as well. Another way is perspective. Now you have organic perspective and you have linear perspective. And you might be more familiar with linear perspective with like cityscapes, the one point, 2 point kind of type of deal that helps you create that sort of depth pretty much instantaneously because you're using it more structured perspective. Now, organic perspective is more like a force. You have to use more artistic license in creating that perspective and that sense of depth. And they aren't mutually exclusive. You can combine the two. As you see here as in my sketch, the bridge is going to be in a linear perspective and everything around it is organic. So you don't have to focus in on just one in a piece. You can combine the two. We can also have one or just one. So it just depends on what you need for that landscape. So as we wrap up this sketch, we are going to be jumping into painting. And that's when we can really sell this piece and create this three-dimensional illusion on this 2D surface. So when I'm setting up the sky, I am thinking about what kind of color I'm going to have throughout the piece as a type of fog or atmospheric color that I'm going to have to help push objects back in this space. So I went with a blue color and a yellow, well, almost white color to help with the illusion of sun coming through on that very back area. So one of the techniques of creating this depth that we're going to set up is a lot of focusing on layering and detail work. And layering, as you see, I do a lot of working background to foreground, which helps me control the color and the amount of detail I'm putting in, and I don't have to worry about one area being too detailed when it's so far back. Now, the farther back the object is, the less detail we are going to see in the object. So these far back trees I'm doing mostly as silhouettes of them, and not too much detail. So there's going to be a darker blue of the color rather than too much color. Now, as we get closer to the viewer, we are going to add more color, more detail, and that's going to really help separate each zone of the piece and sell that sense of depth. And I always do silhouettes far back because we don't see much of it, and then adding a either gradient or going in with a soft brush as a gradient for my atmosphere to have at the bottom part to have like a sense of fog and really set it more into the piece. Sometimes I will take a soft brush and take the sky color if part of the area is too dark and help it push it back a bit more. And those help create that sense of depth. And a lot of this process is called atmospheric perspective. So a lot of the objects in the back tend to be lighter, less detailed, because they're taking more of the color of the sky or the atmosphere compared to those in the foreground. So you'll see a lot more of the sky color in the far back. And as we get closer, they have less of that. Now, I do add a bit of the sky color in the shadows, just because that's how it will be bouncing that light into the shadows and it helps create a sense of roundness of the object and set it more into the scene. And it's a little another detail element for the foreground compared to the background to help really separate the two. And the second row of trees, I added a bit more green so it's not a quick jump between the row of trees that I'm doing. It has a little bit of gradation of color being added to help slowly push us forward into the scene. Now, it's not going to be super vibrant as we get close to the foreground because I do want to keep them more of a cooler tone with the blue green and the blue color back there to help them be um, more far back in the scene. And I'm never too worried about, especially setting up the background, if it's not clean in the selection. Like these trees are bleeding into other parts of the scene in the foreground because they'll eventually get covered up uh, with those elements. And I was leaning more to the fall color, so adding a bit more of the oranges to these back trees to help with the feeling of it being fall was another point I wanted to do for these trees. And for these trees right here, the row of trees, yeah, I wanted to change how I did the gradation on them, having more of a blue tone towards the bottom and the orange tone towards the top. Hi, Squeedo. And I made that switch because I liked it better with the sunlight hitting the top of the row trees and the cool color coming up from the bottom. I felt it hit more in the set more in the scene a bit better than what I originally had been played. So now we're going to be working on the water. And all I'm going to do is just make a selection and fill it with the sky color. And I'll be back to it later. I do the water last because I like having everything else in the scene done. So when I'm doing reflections and everything, I can just color pick uh, for that scene and do it without having to guess what color I'm going to put there. And I like using the lasso tool to quickly select large chunks of my scene to help me just quickly fill, and I don't have to worry about any empty space that I might have missed if I was just using a brush. And especially when I'm doing stuff that's organic, even, I guess you, yeah, I guess even if I was doing building stuff, I would still use the lasso tool. Just even more so with buildings to help get that nice straight edge if that's what I'm looking for. But lasso tool, very good tool. Highly recommend. So I wanted this ground to kind of be initially more on the orange side. We are going to change it to more of a green tone, but either way, I wanted this to be a bit more back in the scene, so I'm going to be more on the desaturated side. I'm not going to be as saturated as when we get to the right side, and the values are going to be closer together, so they're not going to be really bright brights and really dark darks. We're going to have them kind of closer together in the mid-tone range. And this, well, to differentiate this side being a bit more back and the other side a bit forward, even if we didn't have the bridge, it would still help with that sense of depth. With the bridge, it kind of already helps create that. If you ever had like a path, or you see me do a bunch of rivers, that's kind of a quick and easy way to create a sense of depth in your drawing, especially if you do it with the nice winding and it gets thinner as you get farther away. It helps really sell that scene with a sense of depth before you even put any paint on this canvas. Forgot to mention that when we were in the sketching process. So these trees that I'm gonna put in, I want to do birch trees. So playing around with more of a tan, almost purplish kind of color for this bark instead of the usual brown trees I do, just to switch it up a bit. So after I put, I'm going to do each kind of row of trees on a separate layer to help with the leaves and creating that depth in the leaves and building it up with that layering, and having like things overlap helps push the objects behind it back more. Uh, that's just how we register it. If something's behind something, the object that is the farthest back is get pushed. And I fill the ground back with green because after seeing it with the trees, I didn't like the orange grass. And I'll go back and put in all the lights, the shadows, and the darks and everything on the grass as soon as I get done with this row of trees. But these trees aren't going to have so much detail as we get closer to, I think I did 3 row of trees on this one. They will gradually get more and more detail to help push the far back trees farther back. But they're going to have a little bit more detail than the trees that are currently behind now. So some lights, some shadows, but nothing too much with detail. Hopefully that made sense. And the same principle I am going to apply with the leaves. They're not going to be as saturated as the ones closer to us or as dark. And with these trees, when it comes to leaves, I just do this block in brush. I have 2 colors set on the different color changing ones, and I set the brush to uh, change the color depending on how much my brush opacity is. I mean, pen pressure is, and that allows the 2 colors to mix, so it's not straight one color. It's gonna have a variety of color within it. And then when I add the texture on top to have a little bit of a leaf uh, detail on it, it will have a variety of color on it as well. That's just the way I found that works best for me when I create leaves. But I still wanted to keep that fall vibe going. So that's why these trees are going to be more yellow and orange instead of the green. Just to kind of break it up with the green I'm going to have with the background trees and the grass. And these trees are just going to be slightly darker as we get closer. But they're going to also have a little bit more detail and a little bit more saturation to bring them a bit forward. And we'll continue that throughout with all these other trees. Just adding a bit more detail, bringing a bit more saturation color to them. Same with the leaves. Adding a bit more orange to it, upping the contrast between the two to kind of really push the trees that we want forward. Now I'm using the straight edge lasso tool to quickly select a box around the bridge, and now I'm going to use the organic lasso tool to cut out the semicircles and the little cutaway into the hill, instead of just using one type of lasso tool. Combine the two to quickly get this bridge filled in. And I keep this bridge more on the bluer side, just to make it feel like stone. And it's simple shading on this guy right here. I separate the two sections, the flat side and then the underneath part of the bridge, so that way I don't have to worry about any sort of bleed between the shading when I'm doing it. And the under part of the bridge is more going to be lit by the water, so I use the watercolor to help light the scene. So as I'm adding in the grass texture here, I am going to, hi Squeedo, select different selections of the trees, the bridge, so that way I can set the grass texture behind each one and not worry about accidentally painting it over when I didn't mean to. So you'll see me go back and forth with selecting it all, inverting the selection, and just making sure I get that grass texture in. And then later I'll go in and add some moss to the bridge as another little greenery detail. And I wanted to add a bit more plant life on the grass side, so just adding different plant brushes and textures around to kind of differentiate and add a bit more variety with the plants on this side. So it's not just all one type of plant. And I want to add a bit of kind of movement to the scene. So adding some falling leaves as if the wind is blowing through. So just taking um, this brush called debris, and eventually I'll change it so it's not so transparent. It has a bit more opacity to it. But just bringing it and just swooping it through and putting some on the ground to make it look like the leaves are falling. I thought it was just a little touch that I wanted to try out. And now we're going to work on the rightmost area. And then also this is going to be in shadow with a little bit of light peeking through. Just because the light is coming behind these trees. So a lot of this is going to be a bit more darker, but we're going to add a bit more saturation to have it brought forward a bit compared to the left side. But it's going to be the same process as we did to the left, just using a little bit darker and keeping it more in shadow to kind of have it brought forward and adding a bit more detail to these trees and the rocks. So I'm adding a bit of some shadows on this back hill before I move on with the rest of it to kind of indicate cast shadows and everything. And to put this area a bit more in shadow and add a bit of contrast back here. Just to give it a bit more interest and tone down the light a bit and really push those back trees in the back of the hill back a bit more to help create that sense of depth to actually have them in the back. And help define this bridge a bit more, help strengthen it because we want the bridge to kind of be the focal point of this piece. So to give that the most contrast is ideal. So adding a bit of the shadow there to help push it into that focal view. You're funny, Squiddo. I like putting in all the elements that goes on top of the grass, or at least that's going to be within the grass first before adding the texture, just so I can have all the texture on one layer and everything else on its separate layer. It's just something how I like to do. So I'm going to be adding a bit more detail to these rocks and trees to bring a bit forward. Just adding a bit of a light room from the sky. And then we're going to bring in the eraser. And wherever there is a notch in the tree, just erasing a bit to kind of give it more shape to it that's not just a straight vertical. And giving it a bit more detail work. And doing the same thing in the rocks to actually show chipping in it. Wherever there is a crack on an edge. And adding a bit of that detail also to those left trees in the front row at least, to kind of bring them a bit forward, but nothing too much. Just a little erasing that notch to kind of give them more of an organic look. And then same as we did on the left side with this texture, just selecting the different the trees and rocks so I can have control over where this texture is going and I don't accidentally cover something I didn't mean to. And also adding different plant life as well to add a bit of variety. So I want to add some more falling leaves on this side. When you're doing the leaves, I initially did them the wrong way. They're supposed to go the same direction that I did in the back, going from left to right. I don't know why my brain said do them right to left, but I'll fix it. But you want to keep them going the same direction because the wind's blowing in one direction. It doesn't blow in multiple directions like that. So we'll fix it. But doing the same thing, having the leaves fall and then a bit on the ground to add a bit of color to break up the green a bit and to add a bit more detail to the world. So adding a bit of shadow here just to darken a bit and bring it forward so that the focus kind of remains on that bridge, but not making it all shadow, having a bit of pockets of light that are shining through to add a bit more interest and detail oriented here. And it's going in with a soft brush. I like using a soft brush when I'm doing any shadow or light in a scale like this, just so it's a gradual um, shift and it's not a harsh line. It's softly coming in. Now, most shadows I do a bit more harsh and then towards the end of the shadow make it softer as it gets farther and farther away from the object. So, and the soft brush is on a opacity pin pressure, so the harder I press with the pin, it'll become darker. And it's just a bit more control, adding variety in the shadow. So it's not all one shadow color. So now we're moving on to the water, and this will help sell this sense of depth as well. So I initially changed the colors I'm going to have here, but the whole overall goal is to have this very back area of the water as light as I can. And as we get closer, the colors become more vibrant and a bit darker. I was trying out something new in this first pass, and then I didn't like the way it was turning out. So I just quickly restarted and just did the usual way I do water. I was trying to add the reflections into the water base painting rather than having it on a separate layer. And I didn't like the way it was looking, so I just went with the base color water and doing the reflections on a separate layer like I usually do. And I liked the way it turned out better than what I was trying to do here initially. But when you do water, the darker parts indicate depth of a water rather than shadow. We can add more shadow, but when you're doing the base water, just keeping in mind that if you're going to have darker water, it's going to be perceived as a uh, has more depth in that area of the water compared to a lighter color. Just like when I'm doing shadows, I've learned I like using a soft brush when I'm blending water, just to give it a softer transition between the colors. Now, if it's a harsher water or the water's moving fast, I will switch to the brush I use to block in, to blend, to give the water that sense of movement. Because this water is mostly calm, I want to use the soft brush to show how calm the water is. Something I like to do that's stylistic is adding this shine layer. So taking this ink 2 brush and usually a brown color, coming in, holding down shift to make them straight, and setting it to either color dodge or a lighter color. And it helps give the water a bit of shine to them. This is just a stylistic choice I like. And then erasing part of top and bottom to kind of give the illusion that the sun's coming through and sparkling onto the water. You don't have to do this. This is something I like to do. And I wanted to have a bit of indication that we can see under the water. So adding some rocks underneath. And these are going to have more of a bluish tone to them because they're taking more of the color of the water. And we'll do more indication to show that they are under the water as well, with layering of lily pads and some leaves on the water that have fallen from the trees. And then we'll add our water break as well. So these are all going to help indicate that these are under the water. So adding a bit of depth. And the rocks are only going to be on the side that we see here on the right side. They're not going to go very far. We're not going to see them on the left side. And that helps add the detail, pushing this right area forward towards us, and pushing the left area back more, adding a sense of depth to the scene to show that we can only see under the water here and not far away. And I decided to add a wave texture as another help of indication for detail work up here. And then I'll go back for the bridge and the under curve, adding some of that wave texture as well. Just show a bit of the movement of the water. And just like how we keep the rocks underwater close to us on the right side, this wave texture is only going to be close to us on the right side. And I'm just going to erase using a soft brush to kind of slowly ease it out. So the soft transition from texture to no texture. So coming in and putting in a reflection of the water and also using the ink to brush and just adding color, picking the color and coming in and putting it in and having some indication of trees and the bridge. Not much to it, it's just how the reflection is. And then we're gonna go in and add some lily pads on top and some leaves that have fallen from the trees, like I mentioned earlier, to kind of push those rocks underwater and make it seem like, yeah, they're underwater and adding that depth. And with the lily pads, we're going to make them bigger, closer to us. And as we get farther away from us, we are going to make them smaller. And that's going to sell this sense of depth. So the water break is going to go onto the lily pads and the leaves. And water break is just essentially whenever water hits the edge, it has this bright, almost white um, look to it. It's just when it hits it, the water's changing direction, so it hits the light more. And this adds a bit more detail to show movement of the water. And usually you have water breaks around where an edge is, as water is moving around. Woo! So I also want to add some shadow to show the light casting onto the water, because this bridge is going to cast a shadow, and I just want to indicate that. As well as some on the right side as well from this hill. So I didn't like the way the reflection is looking, so I do a little of a cheat method where I group certain sections together, merge them together, and we're just going to flip them and put them in the water. And that's going to give more of a clear reflection rather than the rough one I did. And either method works. This one just gives you a more one-to-one reflection of how the water would look compared to what I did. But we do blur it so it's not so crystal clear, because the water will distort the reflection slightly. And as we wrap up this piece, basically we are going to darken some of these darks, add a bit more light in other places, and just put in final little touch-ups to separate what I need to have separated and help sell the sense of space. But we're going to put little pockets of light in to show some light shining through. And typically, well, not typically, but sometimes I will merge all the layers I'll duplicate them, then merge them, and then have a blur layer, and then using a layer mask and slowly having the background blurred. If I ever want to kind of focus in on the focal point, or if I have a certain feel I want to go, like if I have a lot of lighting going on with a village or a very foggy scene, it helps create more of that fog and helps push everything back and have a sense of depth to the background and push everything forward that needs to come forward. I didn't do it in this piece because I didn't think I needed it, but that is something I do sometimes. And that's how I made this piece. So I hope this was helpful and you guys have a fantastic day. Thanks so much for watching. I hope these little tricks to help you create sense of depth help